I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and thank you for the amazing opportunity to, you know, present my research. It was a long, strenuous process, but at the end of it, it was a very, very rewarding process in general. Just a little bit about me. I am currently a ninth year teacher. I teach social science. I've taught high school and middle school, but I currently teach in Irvine Unified School District at Venado Middle School. I am currently also enrolled in the Cal State Long Beach history grad program where I'm getting my master's. I'm currently in my second year. And the whole, I guess, the reason why I'm doing this is so I can become a better teacher at the end of the day. And I can show my students what it's like to think like a historian and how to conduct historical research in an effective manner. And so I'm kind of doing this to model to my students, and I'll get to brag to them later on about this. So they'll get the link, and maybe I might incentivize some extra credit so they can see this presentation. So with that being said, I want to go ahead and begin my presentation. As you have probably seen on the website, my focus of my research is on the Brown Berets. My research paper is called Militant, Machismo, Hypermasculinity, and the Brown Berets. Just a little bit about the Brown Berets. Amid the energetic fervor of the Chicano movement during the 1960s, several prominent Mexican activists addressed the vast educational, financial, and political inequalities plaguing the Mexican-American community. However, diverse splinter groups within the movements held considerably different viewpoints on how to realize the movement's broader goals. While some chose to employ some passive resistance tactics, others decided to address the issues with more force. The emergence of the Brown Berets, a paramilitary subfaction within the Chicano movement, showcased the progressive willingness of Chicanos to employ a more forceful activist platform. The organization's expression of machismo and its blatant stance against the oppressive brutality committed by the LAPD initially prompted a warm reception from the Chicano communities nationwide. Consequently, the organization's reach mushroomed in a considerably short period throughout the southwestern portion of the United States, attracting street youth who wanted to take immediate action against the oppressive state. Before I continue on with this presentation, I do want to talk about a couple things. I would like to address the kind of sources that I utilized when I conducted this research. So a lot of this research is dependent on oral testimonies I was able to find through archives, and I even conducted a personal interview with a former member, actually the leader of the Brown Berets, who's still active to this day. The LA Times newspaper was also a big source of information for myself. And the organization had their own form of newspaper, La Causa, and we'll talk about that later on. I've also visited several archives, particularly in Cal State LA, where I was able to essentially dig into the archives that were there, and I was able to pull out some important information, and of course, personal letters that I found within those archives. The entry point that I would like to address today is that this analysis provides an examination of the machismo culture within the Brown Beret organization. It's based on the framework which I borrowed from Ramon Gutierrez's essay, in which he outlines an argument that pretty much said that Chicano men invested themselves with images of power to reclaim a sense of political empowerment previously denied to them by the oppressive structures of the capitalist state. And my research mainly depended on this central question, which was, what impact did the militant machismo culture have on the organization's rise to prominence and its decline? My thesis that I make with this essay is that the militant machismo promoted by the Brown Berets played a significant role in propelling the organization to a state of relevance. Over time, however, the same militant masculinity caused internal and external friction, which ultimately contributed to its untimely collapse. So somewhat of a double-edged sword that I'll go into in more in depth. Before I begin talking about the Brown Berets and the formation of the organization, I need to talk about the context from which the Chicano community is dealing with at this period of time. For most of the 20th century, the barrios of the Southwest have had a devastating legacy of police brutality. Within their respective communities, Chicanos were the targets of disproportionate racial profiling and police harassment accompanied with unwanted traffic stops, beatings, and shootings. For example, in one episode of police brutality, police officers in East LA reportedly responded to a noise complaint on May 26, 1951. Forcing entry into a house and assaulting an 8-month-old pregnant woman and a disabled man on top of that. Now, according to the news reports from the incident, the police broke the leg of Frank Rodriguez when he attempted to provide aid in the situation. But there were more instances like this. We had another notable event, which would then stimulate, a young Chicano activist group to passion. The Young Chicanos for Community Action, they were a group that fundamentally saw police brutality as a strong issue within their community. And so their goals were to address it head on as best as they could. In one particular episode of police brutality, there was an instance where a young Chicano by the name of Danny Hernandez was actually they said was hung by a LA sheriff's deputy, and that prompted a lot of outrage within the community. And so a young activist, David Sanchez, rallied other members of this young Chicano activist group to picket the local sheriff's department. In the process, Sanchez dispersed the now iconic Brown Beret to his fellow members to don, so that when they protested with some force. And so, David Sanchez, being a former, member of the army trainings within the high schools, he felt that he needed some regimen within the group, and so the berets kind of embodied that form of discipline that they typically would receive in the JROTC programs. And so this direct activist approach marked a significant shift in the direction of the young YCCA organization. Sanchez assumed a leadership position within the activist organization, and the group's platform began to promote a more militant stance against police brutality. So why machismo? Since the inception of the Chicano movement, expressions of machismo have maintained a significant role in the operations of the more militant Chicano nationalist organizations. To many linguistically limited outsiders, machismo typically represents an aggressive expression of hypermasculinity. Various researchers and familiar observers such as Maxine Bacazin and Marvin Goldwert suggest that machismo manifests itself through various dysfunctional behaviors as it defines men as patriarchal and domineering. Here's a quote from Omar Castañeda, who is another researcher who has a different approach to what machismo is. Machismo is complex and multifaceted. Too often in Anglo-American interpretations reduced to self-aggrandizing male bravado that flirts with the physical harm to be sexual, like some running from the right to pass on genes. Well, there is another machismo that is quite different. And in this sense, I'm making the argument that machismo in itself is an empowering tool for this organization. They clung on to this sense of hypermasculinity to essentially assert in a form of empowerment, which they felt was taken away from them from the state. And so this is why we talk about machismo when in talking about the Brown Berets. Now, when the Brown Berets formed, they outlined an effective 10-point program, and the 10-point program is very reminiscent of another militant group, the Black Panthers. And a lot of it is very reminiscent of the 10-point program of the Black Panthers, but there are some things that are specific to the Brown Berets. First and foremost, they preached unity and equality for all within the barrio. a big component of the Brown Berets is they also advocated for the right to a bilingual education and rights guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And just like the Black Panthers, they advocated for the creation of a civilian police review board made up within the community to screen all previous police officers before they are assigned to their communities. And on top of that, there's an educational component to this, and it's about teaching true Mexican American history within the schools of LA. Brown Berets really took prominence in one major historical event, and that was during the Los Angeles City blowouts. So during this time period, we had a lot of angry Chicano students who protested, the educational settings. A lot of them felt that they were being deprived of a fair education. And so as a result of that, it prompted a lot of students to essentially walk out and protest. And it was a massive protest that essentially got a lot of different schools involved. And it was a very popular movement to essentially, empower these students. Now, a big component of that was the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets claim responsibility for actually starting the blowouts, the walkout protest. They claim that they were the ones that actually put this platform on, and they pushed everyone to essentially get up and demand action. Now, during the blowouts, because of their militant uniforms, the teacher who was a big influence during the protests, Sal Castro, actually told the Brown Berets that not to wear their uniforms at all. He advised them that you're there to get in the way of the cops and get nasty, but if you come, don't wear your uniforms, do the college boy act. And that was not what the Brown Berets ended up doing. And in the end of it, they showed up with their full military gear, and they were seen as these kind of defenders who put themselves in position in front of these police officers so that they could essentially take the brunt of the brutality as the police officers kind of latched on and try to break up the protest. They helped to guide other students out of harm's way, and in a sense they built up a good reputation amongst the young students, but also in the broader Chicano community in LA. And so here we are, we have this new group who now has become a defender of the community. And so we have these different perception of them. The Brown Berets were regarded as the tough men of the barrio. They defended their communities from violent acts of police brutality, pledging to confront police whenever they were perceived an instance of violence. Their presence won them immediately with respect from the community, who viewed them as a transformative organization. And there's a famous quote that's right here that I posted, that the Brown Berets take care of business and leave the politicking and mouthing to others. Their numbers are growing and growing and growing. Bueno, ya no se dejan, meaning they didn't let themselves, get harmed. They would take action whenever they felt that they needed to take action. On top of that, there was, a bit of a push to recruit a different type of Chicano. The paramilitary masculine culture just appealed to different types of Chicanos in the communities. Gang members in particular were very enamored by the militant I guess rhetoric that was being said about this group. And so they decided to essentially recruit these different gangsters within the community. And in return, they would leave, they would clean up their act, and they would become soldiers for the barrio. So they would recruit these people that they called the vato locos, and they wanted them to essentially be reformed members who essentially embodied the poor working class masculinity. So the Brown Berets, were militant macho men, and they had a reliable appearance throughout the community. There was said before by David Sanchez that a lot of mothers clubs helped them with their contributions. Men clubs, they were happy to see that they were cleaning up the communities. They liked what they were doing with the gang, and so essentially they were welcomed with open arms. Their reliability was essentially helped them to establish more ambitious projects, and in one in particular, they helped to create the El Barrio Free Clinic. Which was a free clinic, as it says, where they, the Berets hosted, they got a bunch of doctors and physicians to come in and provide these people who previously didn't have access to medical care, necessary, care if they desired it to have it. And so, but it isn't always perfect at this point in time. So as a result of their hypermasculinity, we are seeing the creation of a gender tension. And so we see that women were openly embraced within the ranks of the organization. Their roles were often relegated to subordinate roles, though, under the male leadership. Women would do a lot of the brunt work for the organization. And I spoke earlier about the free barrio clinic, where the women essentially took the leadership role, getting all the materials that needed to keep the clinic working. But at the end of the day, they were treated unfairly, and they were treated less than the main male leadership figureheads. And the males got all the great reception, and the females hardly received anything. There is a famous quote from another female Brown Beret member, and she said that the men wanted to make all the decisions, and we always got the shit jobs. At fundraisers, the girls did all the cooking and always got stuck with the cleaning, and the guys would just hang out around the clinic, or they'd hang out around the facilities, and they didn't really do any work. On top of that, the women were essentially, they were expected, if the men were arrested, they had to go bail them out at various different points. And so they kind of needed them to play the secondary role. And the women were just fed up with this role. There was also rumors of sexual assaults and harassment between other members within the organization. And eventually, Gloria Arianes, who happened to be a prominent member in the organization, she, eventually said that she had enough. She gave the men an ultimatum and said that if they didn't clean up their act, that essentially she would take all the women and walk out. And that's exactly what she did. She published a letter in which she outlined her grievances to the Brown Berets. She had believed that essentially that the male leadership had treated them worse than the oppressive state had ever done. And as a result of that, they had it. They said, "Ya basta, we are leaving. We're going to create a new thing, and we're going to take ownership of this free barrio clinic, because we're the ones that are putting in the effort to actually run this clinic effectively." And so they created a splinter group from there. There were different efforts to kind of get women back into the organization, but for the most part, by the 1970s, early parts of the 1970s, the women had essentially, were out of the organization, and they created splinter organizations like Las Adelitas de Aztlán. And the Brown Berets never really recovered that from that female membership loss as a result of that. And later on, when the men stormed, there's another public act in which they go to Catalina Island to protest the fact that it was taken by American settlers. As you can see in this picture, there's only one female member left in the organization at this point, and her job was to provide food for all these men, which was unfortunate during this circumstance. But of course, we also had other criticisms of the organization as well. There was, because of this masculinity essentially provided this outwardly dangerous image as well, and there was police infiltration within the organization because they were kind of considered to be a radical, dangerous group that was subverting the goodwill of these Chicano communities. So the impact of the infiltration is that the infiltration of law enforcement agencies also succeeded in altering the external image of the organization from masculine defenders of the community to subversive and troublemaking nuisances. So law enforcement agents justified their treatment of the organization by depicting the Berets as a group of communist sympathizers. And in a Los Angeles Times article, Mayor Sam Yorty accused the group of indoctrinating the minds of young Chicanos within their with communist militant ideologies. The gangs of the community despised the heavy police attention brought forth by the Berets, and the gangs responded by setting fire to the organization's head office, indicating that they were not welcome within the community anymore. And then finally, in 1972, the Brown Berets officially dissolved. David Sanchez had said that essentially the organization could not continue going forward, that there was too much subversion, and there were threats to the leadership involved within this organization. And so David Sanchez had effectively dissolved the Los Angeles chapter, which was the focus and the main central organization of the Brown Beret movement. Now, the significance. Now, ultimately, this analysis of the Brown Berets illustrates the transformative and destructive potential of hypermasculinity within the broader activist platform of the Chicano movement. Initially, its militant machismo helped garner support from the community as the organization represented an authentic revolutionary sect of the Chicano movement. The Brown Berets were the shock troops and the vanguards of the movement who spoke action into their form of activism. Their macho militancy had a broad appeal to men and women of various different backgrounds who flocked to join their ranks. However, the machismo was also detrimental to the longevity of the group. The overt militant masculine rhetoric generated hostilities with law enforcement. The state employed surveillance and infiltration tactics to disrupt the operation of the organization. Lastly, the militant machismo also divided the organization's membership as it forced women to adopt undesirable subordinate roles within the organization, promoting the growth of a feminist movement within the organization that could not coexist with the patriarchal structures of the organization. Consequently, the Brown Berets, hypermasculinity represented a double-edged sword for the organization as it first propelled and later destroyed them. Studying the Brown Berets in terms of gender and masculinity provides an invaluable insight onto why the Brown Berets and the Chicano movement more broadly failed to create sustainable social change during the 1960s and 70s. The organization's overt masculine representation restricted some participation within the imagined Chicano community. This limited imagining hindered the empowerment of the ethnic Mexican-American community. Although the Brown Berets did little to change the status quo, the organization still bears some significance as their protests reflected the realities of what it meant to be Mexican-American during the 1960s. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Let's actually talk about a couple things from the presentation itself. For example, you had that slide that had all the elements of the 10-point plan that they were espousing. And if you go through them individually, it's interesting how so many of them are actually familiar in one way or another, that have either become part of what we would normally see as normal or are now being discussed again as far as, well, this is something that we should be doing for people today. For example, basically the minimum stipend, if you want to call it that $8,000 that they suggested. Well, there's been discussion about minimum income, and the city of LA is actually doing a pilot program with a certain amount of money and a certain amount of participation with something like that. So it's always interesting to me is how some of these far-reaching ideas, actually find their way back into the discussion again. And historically speaking, it's always wonderful to notice that they were talking about this 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the wonderful things about being a historian, is that there's nothing new under the sun, as as the old story goes. And so I don't know if you want to point anything out about that specific 10-point plan.
Yeah, I glanced over it because I didn't want to, really delve in too much into it because we had a lot to go over. But and I agree with what you're saying. There's these are the basic things. There's it's showing a sense of continuity of what these kind of underrepresented communities are kind of wanting and desiring for themselves, like to essentially make up for those vast inequalities that they feel have plagued the community. And so these are common things that we consistently see, and if you see reform to police brutality, and we see that outlined in their 10-point program. And in a sense that you're seeing people wanting to be represented, and they want to take care of the community. They want these things for themselves because they felt that they have been denied, these basic, you can call it rights, these human rights. And so, I'm glad that you pointed that out. And it is an interesting fact, again, that these things are coming up again and again and again. But I still find it quite interesting that a lot of these 10-point plans, if you were to look at the Black Panthers as well, it deals a lot with educational reform, social justice reforms, economic reforms, and these are just common threads that we see continuously. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Sure. And now, the Brown Berets, of course, are not as well known today or discussed as much today as, say, compared to the Black Panthers. Is it possible, and this may be speculation as much as anything else, is it possible that because they were not as armed as the Panthers were, there are no martyrs within the Brown Beret community, whereas the Panthers certainly did? Is it possible that because the body count, however you want to describe it, the casualties were not high in the Brown Beret efforts? Is it easier to kind of forget about them, whereas there was more blood spilled, there was more chaos and danger with the Black Panthers, or is there something else going on? Because obviously they were both communities of color, they were both oppressed, but they took different tactics to try to do some of the same reforms.
Right. No, I kind of find that point to be interesting, and it is interesting that you propose that, because the Brown Panthers did believe in essentially the right to the Second Amendment, just like as the Black Panthers did. But a lot of the leadership, essentially didn't own guns, or, they didn't carry around firearms. But some of the more, I guess, the outlandish members, they did brandish weapons, and they were arrested frequently. But we didn't see these things, I guess, like in terms of the Los Angeles chapter, we didn't see these episodes of shootouts with the police. Or, and I think that's interesting that you say, like, the reason why we remember the Black Panthers is because of these violent episodes. So I don't necessarily know if that's the case. Whereas, I do think that the Black Panthers really set the precedent for the Brown Berets. And so by the time the Brown Berets, operated in the Chicano community, it wasn't necessarily, a new thing necessarily, wasn't necessarily a new militant organization that's trying to fight for equality for a marginalized group. And so I think that it's because the Black Panthers really paved the way for these different groups. I think that's why the Black Panthers get this more of a reception. And I'm not sure if it's necessarily the violent actions necessarily, because there were episodes of violent actions. Like, for example, I didn't necessarily get the time to go over it in my research, but there an action where supposedly someone had set fire to the Biltmore Hotel, and that's when Ronald Reagan had actually been there. There were bomb threats. And so there's these discussions about, like, what kind of members these people are. But it's an interesting thought that you bring up. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges of having an organization with as much machismo as the Berets had is that, but when they're doing their thing, that's also the time that women's lib is starting to make some strong strides. And so did that put the Chicanas in conflict because they could see what was going on elsewhere, and yet they were being kind of restrained?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's definitely like a part of the whole conversation as well, is that the Chicano nationalist movement naturally like clings on to these like the propelling of these like hyper masculine figures, right? It's embodying this sense of masculinity to reclaim this sort of empowerment. And the Black Panthers did it too. And at that same time, like you're saying, like women essentially get relegated to the back. And we have women who are essentially coming around, and they're seeing these different reforms, especially in with the women's rights movements, and they're seeing where their place is within the Chicano movement, and they're thinking to themselves, why aren't I being propelled to the front of these protests? Why can't I have a leadership position? And so they're being marginalized, and a lot of them are fighting back as a result of that. Though they care about the cause for helping support their racial community, they're essentially being marginalized within that community continuously. And so there is that continued conflict, that yes, we are Chicanas, but we're part of the Chicano community, but we're also women who are getting downplayed and treated unfairly. And so there's that continuous conflict that is coming around, and based off my own research and looking at oral interviews with Gloria Arianes, she was saying these things too. Just because I'm a female doesn't necessarily mean that I have to take care of the male members all the time. That's not my job. My job isn't just to sit there and have kids. My job is to be a soldier on the front lines, a revolutionary. And that's the thing, is women weren't treated as true revolutionaries within the movement.
If I can throw in just one more thought,
Mhm.
is I grew up in Orange County in the 60s and 70s. The Santa Ana was basically the barrio as far as us Orange County white kids were concerned. And so if history is all local, and you're teaching in Irvine in the district there, is there any localized identification with, say, the Orange County Hispanic history, with what you're thinking about teaching with with this East Los Angeles Hispanic history? Is there, I mean, do any of your students make any connections between what you're talking about and what their community is like, or was like at one time?
Yeah, I would say yes, they do. I teach in Irvine. So in Irvine, we don't have, and I used to teach in Santa Ana too, so I understand with the context that you're talking about. So the Chicano community, I feel like a lot of the times Latinos in general are always looking for these different figures of like, empowerment, or these different ways that like essentially aren't, these different people that aren't represented within the US history textbook as much. And so anytime they see like an organization like this, or someone, a movement or protest they feel essentially represented and heard. And so these are the things I've seen common times. Like essentially, they get confused that, and they think that the civil rights movement, during the 1960s and 1970s, only applied to African Americans, and they don't see themselves within the larger struggle for, equality, even though they feel marginalized by all means. And so when they hear stories about this, they make the connection, right? So it's bridging the gap, because it empowers them. It really does. Like, their students really like to hear how different Chicano organizations did something. They didn't stand by and just wait and let feel oppressed. They actually took action. And so, and I've tied that into other things as well. Currently, there is a book which we are I picked up, and I brought that in with conversation with some of the things that I've talked about with my own students, and it's the A People's History of Orange County, which was just released last year. And so they're seeing these different instances of Chicano protests within the broader Orange County, not necessarily in Irvine, but all over, and they're making these connections. And again, it is an empowering, thing to bring back to these students who don't see themselves within the curriculum. And so to show them essentially that their groups, their racial groups had an impact on the history of their communities, on their counties. It's something to be said, because these are the students that feel like deprived for the most part. They don't feel that they have a place within U.S. history, or they don't feel they have a place within what it means to be an American. And so this kind of reestablishes that for them, and it gives them that pathway to see themselves within within U.S. history framework, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you so very, very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing the work you do.
Thank you.